In the late summer of 1873, the sun hung low over the Wyoming Territory, casting a golden haze across the endless plains where dust swirled like ghosts in the wind. Mary Callahan, a woman of 32 with auburn hair tied back in a fraying braid, stood outside the rickety trading post in Bitter Creek, her heart heavy with grief and determination. Her husband James had died 6 months earlier, trampled by a spooked horse, leaving her pregnant with their third child and alone with their 2 children, 8-year-old Tommy and 5-year-old Lila, who clung to her skirts, their faces smudged with dirt and worry. The family's small homestead was failing, the crops wilting under a merciless sun, and the cattle stolen by rustlers who roamed the lawless frontier. Mary had sold everything she could spare to keep them fed, but the money was gone and winter was coming like a shadow across the mountains. Desperate, she had heard whispers of a trading post auction where men down on their luck sometimes sold their labor to survive. With her last dollar clutched in her trembling hand, she entered the dim, crowded room where the air smelled of sweat and whiskey. Men lined up, their eyes hollow from hardship, but one stood apart, a towering figure in a weathered buckskin coat, his face half hidden by a wide-brimmed hat and a beard as wild as the mountains he called home. His name was Gideon Blackthorne, or so the auctioneer called him, a mountain man who trapped furs and lived alone in the high peaks. Mary felt a shiver when his gray eyes met hers, not with malice, but with a quiet knowing that stirred something deep in her chest. She raised her dollar, the only bid she could afford, and to her shock, the auctioneer slammed his gavel, declaring Gideon hers for a single coin. The crowd murmured some laughing at the absurdity of a widow buying a man, but Mary felt only resolve as she led her children and the silent stranger back to their wagon. Gideon said little as they traveled to the homestead, his presence both comforting and unsettling like a storm cloud on the horizon. Tommy peppered him with questions about bears and wolves, but Gideon answered in grunts, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. Lila, shy and wide-eyed, clutched a ragdoll and watched him as if he might vanish into the dusk. At the homestead, a sagging cabin with a leaky roof, Mary offered him a pallet by the fire, but he chose to sleep outside under the stars, his rifle close at hand. Days turned to weeks, and Gideon worked tirelessly mending fences, chopping wood, and teaching Tommy how to track game with a patience that surprised Mary. He never spoke of his past, but his hands rough as pine bark told stories of a life carved from hardship. Mary found herself watching him, her heart torn between gratitude and suspicion, for there was something familiar in the way he moved, like a memory she couldn't place. Lila began to follow him, her tiny shadow trailing as he fixed the barn or hauled water from the creek, and one evening she giggled when he carved her a wooden horse, a rare smile breaking through his grizzled face. Mary's belly grew heavier, her unborn child kicking as she worked beside Gideon, planting late-season crops. To survive the winter, she noticed how he lingered near the children, always watching as if guarding them from an unseen threat. One night, under a sky blazing with stars, Mary asked him why he stayed when he could have walked away. He looked at her, his eyes catching the firelight, and said he had nowhere else to go. His voice was low like gravel shifting in a riverbed, and it stirred that same uneasy familiarity in her heart. The mystery deepened when she caught him staring at an old tintype of her and James, a keepsake she kept on the mantel. His fingers brushed it once, and he turned away as if burned. Suspense hung over the homestead like dust in the air, for Mary sensed Gideon knew more than he let on. Then came the night of the storm, when thunder shook the cabin and rain battered the roof. Tommy woke screaming from a nightmare about his father, and Gideon knelt beside him, his voice steady as he told the boy stories of the mountains until he slept. Mary watched from the doorway, her heart swelling with an emotion she hadn't felt since James was alive. The next morning, as they repaired a fence torn down by the wind, Gideon paused, his hand still on the hammer, and said her name, Mary. Not Mrs. Callahan, but Mary, spoken with a tenderness that stopped her breath. She demanded how he knew her name, for she had never told him, and his face darkened with a secret he could no longer keep. He reached into his coat and pulled out a locket tarnished and worn, its chain broken, but unmistakable. It was the locket she had given James years ago before they married, engraved with her initials. Her knees buckled as Gideon told her the truth. He was James's older brother, long thought dead after a trapping accident in the Rockies. Gideon had survived, but shame and guilt kept him from returning to his family, believing James was better off without him. He had wandered the mountains for years, a ghost among men, until fate brought him to that auction, where he recognized Mary from the tintype James had carried until his death. Gideon had bid his labor not for the dollar, but to protect the family he had failed all those years ago. Mary's heart shattered and mended in the same breath, tears streaming as she realized the man she had bought for $1 was no stranger, but family bound by love and loss. The children listened wide-eyed as Gideon vowed to stay to be the uncle they needed to help raise the baby soon to be born. Winter came, and the homestead thrived under Gideon's strength and Mary's courage. The crops saved and the cabin fortified against the cold. Tommy learned to hunt, and Lila's laughter filled the air as she played with the wooden horse. When Mary's daughter was born, she named her Hope, a symbol of the future they had fought for. Gideon held the baby, his rough hands gentle, and his eyes bright with tears he hadn't shed in years. The mountain man who had lived alone now sat at their table, sharing stories of James that made Mary laugh and cry. The twist of his identity had shocked her, but it was his choice to stay that healed her. The homestead became a home again, not just for Mary and her children, but for Gideon, who found redemption in their love. As spring bloomed across the plains, painting the valley with wildflowers, Mary stood outside the cabin watching Tommy and Lila chase each other while Gideon carved a new fence post. She touched the locket now back in her hands and felt James's presence in the wind, a quiet blessing on the family they had rebuilt. The story of the pregnant widow and the mountain man spread through Bitter Creek, a tale of loss and love, of $1 that bought not a servant but a brother, and of a woman whose strength held them all together. The mountains stood watch over their valleys, silent witnesses to a miracle born from a single coin and a name spoken in the dusk.